الله حق حمده والصلاة والسلام على أشرف أنبيائه ورسله سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وحزبه. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the commentary of Imam Sawi on Jawhara al-Tawhid, we reached line number 95. Right? So we looked at the ruh, right? The ruh, that we don't delve deeply into it. The ulama practically have looked at the subtlety, the latifa, التي بها الحياة والإدراك, by which one is alive and by which one has consciousness. إدراك, right? And that is that subtlety is one, and we expanded that a little bit. That subtlety is one. The ulama looked at it in terms of its outcomes, right? In terms of what it relates to and what it does with it, right? So we said that if it relates to that subtlety, we don't know its ultimate reality, right? But when it relates to its lower desires, its shahawat, what is it called? It's called nafs. When it's related to its inclinations without consideration, or what you could call in English whim, what is it called? Hawa, right? Caprice. Today we're going to be looking at the aql, right? Which is when that subtlety is connected with consideration, right? Tamyiz, right? Tamyiz. The basic function of the aql is tamyiz, right? Is distinguishing, right? So the aql is almost like an accountant, right? Right? But you can do good accounting or bad accounting, right? And then that same latifa, when it is connected with consideration of the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is called the qalb. And when it's connected to Allah Himself, that's when they call it the ruh, right? And there's higher degrees of awareness which they called sir. Some of them talk about that, right? لقد خلوت مع الحبيب وبيننا سر أرق من النسيم إذا سرى. I have indeed been intimate with my beloved, and between us is a secret more subtle than the morning breeze when it blows, right? As one of the poets said, رضي الله تعالى عنهم وتقدست أسرارهم. So, and they found that to be a lot more in line, that investigation is not theoretical or philosophical or speculative. It is related to the maqasid of the deen, the maqasid of the deen, and the khitab of the Quran and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because the Quran talks about these, and these give us a framework for change. Restrain the nafs and the hawa through the aql, through tamyiz, by making choices that of the heart towards cultivating the soul, right? So the operations manager is the aql. But what are you operating? You could be operating a gang, or you could be operating in the presence of the divine, right? Because the aql is just a tool, right? So, but that subtlety itself can be conceived of and is conceived of as nafs. So you have maratibun nafs, the levels of the self. It can also be conceived of as the aql. You have al-aql al-muzlim, and you have al-aql al-rashid, and al-aql al-munawwar, and they use different terms for the aql. And the qalb, you have al-qalb al-marid, and al-qalb al-mutaraddid, the sick heart, the confused heart, al-qalb al-mutaqallib, that goes this way and that, and they have al-qalb al-salim, right? Hawa can also be used in a positive sense, because hawa is al-mail, right? Which is لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به. None of you truly believes until their very whim, meaning their mutlaqul mail, their inclinations, accorded with what I have come with. But rarely is ruh used in a negative sense, right? Anyways, so he says, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, in line number 95, وَالْعَقْلُ كَالْرُوحِ لَكِنْ قَرَّرُوا فِيهِ خِلَافًا فَانْظُرًا مَا فَسَّرُوا. The intellect is like the soul. And we look at how it is like it, right? That ultimately the intellect is from, we don't know its reality, don't need to get into it, because ultimately it's not the reality of it, right? That if you're standing in front of your car, what's your responsibility? It works, I need to get to such and such destination. Now, that's more important than figuring out what kind of engine is this and who exactly built. That's all decorative. What's your responsibility? To get to the destination on time. Right? So that's sort of the ihris ala ma yanfa'uk. This is the dabit ad-din, right? The religious consideration. Be avid for all that will be of your benefit, ultimately. Right? So there's khilaf in not delving into it, but the aql is also like the ruh insofar as there are things that we can discern regarding it. And they mention some khilaf regarding it. One of the khilaf is, what is the maqar of the aql? Where is the seat of the intellect? Ultimately, we don't know. Right? And number two, what is the relationship between the mind and the intellect? And this is an interesting insight, because they're realizing that the assumption that the brain is the seat of cognition is a little cloudy. And much modern science is questioning that. Right? That where exactly, right? So they said that the mind, right, the dimagh, it's alatun lil idrak. It's a tool of cognition. But that consciousness, right, is through that latifa, that subtlety. That subtlety has some relationship to the physical heart. But where is it? Min amri rabbi. It's from the affair of my Lord. And much has been written about that. The other larger comment, like the author's commentary, unpacks the larger one particularly. Awn al-Murid unpacks that khilaf a little more. Ibn Kamal Basha in his Rasail has an accomplished treatise discussing that. But Imam al-Ghazali discusses it in the opening of the Ihya, in the Kitab al-Ilm. So he says, قوله والعقل كالروح, the intellect is like the soul. هو أي العقل لغة المنع لأنه يمنع صاحبه من العدول عن سواء السبيل. The aql comes from al-mana'. عقل دابته is to tie something down, and by tying something down, you prevent it from going beyond limits. That's why the thing that some of the Arabs wear on top of the shawls when they put them on their heads. What's it called? Iqal. Right? Right? And that's why it's important. So one of the great points, ترك العقل في هواك رجال. Right? Accomplished ones left. It's not just the intellect, but al-aql, they left all restraint in their yearning for you. ليس للعقل, the intellect في سناك مجاله. The intellect has no role before your dazzling beauty. But also, when you know that there's dazzling beauty, why would you have restraint? Right? Because it prevents the person of intellect from veering from the upright way. And this is hikmah. This is not the lexical sense of aql. Right? Aql, in the language, because aqala is to restrain. What does it basically restrain from? From making wrong choices. Right? Should I buy those camels? The aqil doesn't, right? They say كَفَى بِالْمَرْءِ جَهْلًا أَنْ يَسُرَّهُ مَا يَضُرُّهُ. Right? It's enough folly for a person to be pleased with what harms them. واصطلاحا, and technically, اختلف فيه كالروح. There's difference of opinion, like the intellect. فَلِذَا شَبَّهَهُ بِهَا. That's why he compared it to it, compared the intellect to the soul. فَقَوْلُ الْمُصَنِّفِ كَالروح, like the soul, من حيث الخوض فيها والوقوف عن ذلك, in terms of delving into it and speculating about it, generally. And if one steps into it, then one steps into it على طريقة الإسلاميين, in the ways of the scholars of Islam. But لكن قرروا فيه خلافا, but they have explained regarding it difference. استدراك على ما يتوهم من تمام التشبيه. This is a correction of what could be wrongly imagined as being a complete comparison. وأن الخلاف الذي وقع في الروح هو عين الخلاف الذي في العقل. And that the difference that has been related regarding the soul is the same difference that is related about the intellect. قال الشيخ الإسلام, Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, right? And Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari has a brief work on definitions that's published it's actually more like just a risala, but bloated it was turned into. And Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari lived for 103 years. He started teaching in his early teens. He taught 9 decades. So he jumped entire generations. There's people whose great grandfather studied with him when he was young, and they studied with him. That's why you find him in a lot of asanid. Right? Also because he had musharaka in an active role in so many sciences. He was an imam across all the major Islamic sciences. Right? And was a very distinguished Shafi'i jurist. He's one of the 5 commentators on the Minhaj of Imam Nawawi, even though he doesn't have a comment. He didn't comment on the Minhaj because he took Minhaj al-Talibin of Imam Nawawi and he abridged it, and he abridged the title as well. So his abridgment of Minhaj al-Talibin is Manhaj al-Tullab. It has the same meaning. That's the meaning of ikhtisar. So even the title points to the fact that I am reducing the size but preserving the meaning. And he wrote a brilliant commentary on his abridgment called Fath al-Wahhab. And that Fath al-Wahhab has one of the great hawashi of the Shafi'i school, Hashiyat al-Jamal ala Fath al-Wahhab. Al-Jamal, who was both blind and single. But he made the most of his life. He wrote some great works. Anyways, Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari wrote many other important works in Shafi'i fiqh. He also wrote commentaries in hadith of great distinction. He has a brilliant mid-sized commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari. He commented on the Shama'il. He commented a number of other books of hadith. He wrote a sharh on the Alfiya of al-Iraqi in the science of hadith, which is a mid-sized but brilliant sharh. He wrote commentary on the Burda, mid-sized commentary, brilliant. He wrote the commentary on the Risala al-Qushayriya, and that and other works in Tasawwuf tell you about his great spiritual insight. That commentary of Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari on the Risala al-Qushayriya has a hashia by al-Arusi, Shaykh al-Islam Mustafa al-Arusi, one of the truly great Shaykh al-Islams of one of the great Shaykh al-Azhars. Brilliant, right? Hashiyat al-Arusi. And that is the one complete commentary and super commentary on the Risala al-Qushayriya. نتائج الأفكار القدسية, right? The results of sanctified considerations. Right? Anyways, Shaykh Islam Zakaria al-Ansari also wrote in the Aqliyat. He has a number of important works in Ilm al-Kalam, amongst them on Sharh al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya, and on other works. He also name a science, and he wrote in Mantiq on Isaghuji. I think Shaykh Ahmed al-Azhari, he's teaching, I believe, the Matla', which is Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari's commentary on Isaghuji. That's what Shaykh Adib used to teach. And on. Radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. He started his life so poor that he would go to the garbage dumps around Cairo and dig up like watermelon rinds and other leftover things and survive on that. But it didn't cut him off from seeking knowledge. At the end of his life, he had a whole bunch of people managing his wealth and his charity. Radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. He has a beautiful biography, and his biography is worth reading. There's a beautiful brief biography of his in the same work we referenced before, called al-Tabaqat al-Sughra of Imam al-Sha'rani. It was often neglected. Imam al-Sha'rani kept his company. Radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. Right. So, قال شيخ الإسلام هو غريزة يتهيأ بها لدرك العلوم النظرية وكأنه نور يقذف في القلب. Right? So he says, غزيرة, it's غزيرة is like temperament. It's a deeply ingrained, something deeply ingrained in one's nature, right? It's a temperament by which one yutahayya, one is fit, one is made fit to discern, idrak, to discern knowledge acquired through reasoning, right? And there's a powerful definition it points to. There's a temperamental nature to knowledge, to intellect. There is a isti'dad, there is a readiness. It is also the act of idrak, of consideration. It also relates to the act of reasoning, and it also points to the results of the reasoning. So in this definition, there are he's put together 5 of the elements of the definition of the intellect. It's a brilliant definition if one pays attention. It's a ghazira. There's a temperamental thing. Some people are smarter than others. Right? But there's tahayyu, yutahayya'u biha, by which one becomes capable, right? Right? So that capacity can be cultivated too. Lidark, to discern. That's the role of the intellect, discerning through reason, right? or the knowledge acquired through reason. So it points to reason and what is acquired and the result of the acquiring. Right? So these are all related to aql and ilm. وَكَأَنَّهُ, it's as if it is a light placed in the heart. Because at the end of the day, right, and there's this amazing quote from Ibn Malik from his Khutbat al-Tasheel. Ibn Abdin quotes it in the Hashiyah. وَإِذَا كَانَتِ الْعُلُومُ مَوَاهِبِ اخْتِصَاصِيَّةً etc. Right? That ultimately in what is knowledge is divine gifts. Right? There's the sabab, there's asbabul ilm, and the hasil is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But al-asl في هذا العالم is ربط الأسباب بمسبباتها أو ربط المسببات بأسباب. Right? So knowledge, and Allah points to that in the Quran. اتقوا الله ويعلمكم الله. Be mindful of Allah and Allah will teach you. But you got to take the meat. You guys say, I have taqwa, where's the knowledge? Right? And this is, he mentions the book, right? الحدود الأنيقة والتعريفات الدقيقة. This sometimes, because the definitions are small and you kind of like, whatever. But this is Shaykh al-Islam. أي فمحله القلب. So he says, so therefore its place is the heart. Right? وَنُورُهُ فِي الدِّمَاغ. And its light is in the intellect. كما ذهب إليه الإمامان مالك والشافعي رضي الله تعالى عنهما وجمهور المتكلمين, and most of the theologians. And they speculated. But the qalb, they don't mean the qalb as-sunubari. The heart, they don't mean the flesh heart, but that subtlety. And its light is in the intellect, meaning what one sees things with. It's a tool, right? وقال بعضهم هو بعض العلوم الضرورية. These different definitions are partitive definitions, right? That some of them said it is some of the necessary knowledges, right? That the aql, intellect, is the first principles, is the building blocks of reasoning. So intellect are the al-ulum al-daruriyah. That there's certain things that are first principles of knowledge, right? That that something can be either moving or still, right? That 2 is more than 1, right? Like there's first principles, and they define these first principles in their place, right? وقال بعضهم هو العلم بوجوب الواجبات واستحالة المستحيلات. Right? That the aql is to know that the necessity of the necessary and the absurdity of the absurd. وجواز الجائزات, and the possibility of the possible. Right? This is describing a sound intellect. وبعضهم لا يعلم حقيقته إلا الله تعالى. No one knows its reality except Allah Most High. وقال بعضهم, and these are all reconcilable definitions, right? وقال بعضهم الروح والنفس والعقل متحدة بالذات مختلفة بالاعتبار. The soul, the self, the intellect are one in their entity, distinct in their consideration. فمن حيث قوام البدن بها تسمى روحا. This is another way of looking at the intellect. The ruh, right, is the life-giving spirit. right? So, being the force by which one is alive, that's one sense of ruh. And these are different ways, right? We're talking about the same subtlety. ومن حيث ميلها للشهوات والحظوظ تسمى نفسا. And in terms of its inclination towards its desires and interests, it's called nafs, self. ومن حيث إدراكها العلوم والمعارف والنظر في عواقب الأمور تسمى عقلا. And in terms of discerning knowledge and matters of knowledge and understanding and reflecting on the consequences of matters, and that's where aql is related to hikmah, right? Right, because there's flat knowledge, which is ma'rifatul ma'lum, is to know the knowable, but wisdom is to discern the knowable and to go beyond to recognize consequence, right? So العاقل غير الحكيم ليس عاقلا على وجه التمام. The person of intellect who's unwise is not truly of sound intellect. There's someone who says, so therefore it is 1 plus 2. So what's the answer? 1 plus 2. That's correct, but that's deficient, right? But if someone tells you, okay, so you broke your laptop, so therefore you broke your laptop. So they can't decide, if you broke your laptop, there's only a few outcomes. You either fix it, or you repair it, or you do something, right? Okay, can we just pause for 1 second? Sorry. This is in your interest, so I just need 2 minutes.
That would be good. I would be good. That would be good. I wouldn't mind that because
Bismillah. ولذلك اشتملت الملائكة على الروح والعقل فقط. It says, and because of this, the angels have a soul because they're living, and an intellect because they discern things. Right? They know this is the person I have to assist. Or if you imagine, for example, the protecting angels, the mu'aqibat, harm warded off, right, etc. So one of the uses of ruh is mabda'ul hayat, right, is the basis of life. So anything that has life has a soul. And there's discussion, do non-living things have a soul, etc.? That's a separate thing. Or is the soul described only for the things that have an intellect? So is the soul just the basis of life? So it's the basis of discernment, of awareness, or life, or cognition, right? And then are non-living things, right, inanimate objects, are they classified as having ruh? Imam al-Ghazali says no, right, that the tasbih of inanimate objects, in min shay'in illa yusabbihu bihamdihi. There's nothing whatsoever except that it glorifies Allah's praises. So he says it's just by their iftiqar, by their neediness to Allah, expresses His glory. But others said no, لا مانع أن يكون حقيقيا. That is الأصل في الكلام الحقيقة. لكن how does it continue? لكن لا تفقهون تسبيحه. But you don't understand. So our failure to understand how they glorify, that's a separate investigation, right? والآدمي على يعني والبهائم على الروح والنفس. Animals have a soul, meaning they, the basis of living, and a self. They have desires which they fulfill. The desires can be, for us, you have prohibited desires, permitted desires, and praiseworthy desires. And the praiseworthy so the desires take all 5 rulings. They're not all bad, right? Not all whims are bad, right? It's only unconsidered whims that are bad. وَالْآدَمِ عَلَى الثَّلَاثِ. And the human has all 3: soul, self, and intellect. فَمَنْ غَلَبَ عَقْلُهُ على نَفْسِهِ الْتَحَقَ بِالْمَلَائِكَةِ. So whoever's intellect predominates over their lower self becomes angelic, becomes like an angel. وَمَنْ غَلَبَتْ نَفْسُهُ عَلَى عَقْلِهِ الْتَحَقَ بِالْبَهَائِمِ. And whoever's self, lower self, predominates over their intellect is like the animals. بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. Right? But rather, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. Right? They are more misguided. The ulama have written a lot about the mahasin al-hayawanat, the praiseworthy qualities of animals. Right? Some animals have more strength, some have more of all kinds of things. لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have truly honored the children of Adam, that Allah has given us moral capacity and choice. Right? And the ulama summarize that there's 5 distinguishing qualities, or some mention 6, of dogs over humans, generally. Yani. Right? Loyalty, trustworthiness, consistency. And you can stop there. How many would you find those 3 qualities? How many do you find 2 of those qualities? How many do you find 1? Loyalty, trustworthiness, consistency. They also mention, so loyalty, trustworthiness, consistency. Sur'atul intibah, quickly noticing things. They say dogs, even in deep sleep, notice things more quickly than others. And it can be disciplined. And these are 5 key qualities of dogs. That's what I mentioned. Right? It says, فَلَا أَقَلْ مِنْ أَن تَكُونَ مِثْلَ الْكَلْبِ إِن لَمْ تَكُنْ أَحْسَنَ مِنْهُ. That the least you should strive to is to be like the dog if you can be better than it. Right? It says, and beware of looking down on a dog if you can be sure that you don't have these 5 qualities. That you're loyal, trustworthy, consistent. What else? Yeah, sari'ul intibah, you notice things quickly. And you can be disciplined. You can be trained. Right? Right? Bismillah. Okay. That's the intellect. سؤالنا ثم عذاب القبر نعيمه حيث نعيمه واجب كبعث الحشر. So he says, are being questioned, then the punishment of the grave and its bliss is necessary, right? Necessary to affirm. So it's in of itself necessary. How is it in of itself necessary? Wajibun. Is it wajibun aqlan? Yes or no? It's a trick question. Right? It's wajibun wujuban aradiyan. It is contingently necessary, rationally. What is the wajib al-aradi? What's the contingently necessary? ما كان جائزا في نفسه وتعلقت إرادة الله تعالى بثبوته. Right? The contingently necessary is something that's in itself possible. Did there have to be a punishment in the grave? Did there have to be a hereafter? In itself, no. But it's contingently necessary because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will and therefore His power related to affirming it. So we say, like, is it necessary there be a punishment in the grave? In itself, no, but actually yes, because Allah has willed it. So kun fayakun, be and it is. Right? So it's necessary rationally, contingently, and shar'an, it's necessary for us to believe it. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has informed us of these matters directly, right? So are being questioned and the punishment of the grave. And the talib al-ilm, again, there's books that a talib al-ilm needs to read, right? Because the books of aqidah assume that you have a modicum of religious concern. The Lives of Man, right? Sabilul Iddikar by Imam al-Haddad. Wonderful little treatise, right? Very clear, right? About the, right? So minimally, there's 3 books one should have read on this. This is Sabil al-Iddikar of Imam al-Haddad, right? And then Dhikr al-Maut, Kitab Dhikr al-Maut from the Ihya, right, of Imam al-Ghazali, 40th book of the Ihya, which is magnificent, right? And that's what we've been going through Thursday nights, Sheikh Yusuf and myself. We've covered in a little more detail than most of the books of the Ihya because Imam Ghazali made it a lot more detailed. And then there is a wonderful work by Sheikh Abdullah Sirajuddin called Al-Iman bi'awalim al-akhirah. Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin, right? Number 4, there's a tadhkira of al-Qurtubi. And 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 there's Al-Kafiyaji has an important work on this, and many others. This is one of the arkan of Iman is about death and the afterlife. And of course, there's the al-ayat, right? And the ayat about the hereafter. And one of the things that Talib al-Ilm should do, any key ayat that come about the hereafter, look at the basic tafsir of them, right? And that's, we cultivate our knowledge in that, right? You read something, right? It says, فَعَالٌ لِمَا يُرِيد. Whoa! You should be seeing your aqidah knowledge. فَعَالٌ لِمَا يُرِيد. The one who does whatsoever. Isn't that sighat umum? Wow. Right? Interesting. So let me dip into a mid-sized tafsir that unpacks that. Ayat, likewise, a hadith, right? A hadith, and that's where a trustworthy companion for things like this is the Mishkat. The Mishkat al-Masabih, because it gathers the major hadiths of the 6 books, right? But you don't have to get to the Mishkat to dip into it. Don't try to be Superman. Read a couple of hadiths, right? Like the section on the hereafter. The slacker's first step is because it's better to be a slacker and take the first step than to be standing at the starting line. He says, oh my God, there's several hundred hadiths on the section on al-akhirah. Let me just read a couple of hadiths in each chapter. So you do a micro exam. That while I'm in this section on the sam'iyat, on the matters of the hereafter, there's whatever, I don't know how many hadith on the akhirah there are on those chapters. So let's say there's 200 hadiths and there's 8 sections. It's okay. So it's going to take us a month to cover the section on the matters of the hereafter. What will I do? I'll do two sections a week. I'll just read a few of the hadiths and skip over things. The really long hadith looks beautiful. Make a note. Beautiful hadith about matters of the hereafter. Long. And you put a little task. One day you're like, what do I do? So, oh, there's that long hadith. Let me figure it out. Well, my teachers asked him, because there's some hadith in Riyadh al-Salihin, there's this really long hadith in Kitab al-Tawbah. What do I do with that? I was a bit intimidated because I don't like reading things I don't understand. It's like without the commentary, it's hard to figure out the hadith of Sayyidina Ka'b. Right? I said, skip it. I said, but get back to it. I said, but it's still big. I said, break it into parts. So I forget, I broke that into 7, 8 parts, and it looked easy. Do part 1, then part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5. So, I want to get to part 6 and 7 because I want to put the whole puzzle together. What happened in the end? Right? So these are just a couple of the resources about matters of the hereafter. Of course, there's so many other matters. Here as well, we looked at this in Sharh al-Kharida as well. Right? He has a nice breakdown there. So one reviews what comes in one in the other. Okay. سؤالنا أي مما يجب اعتقاده سؤال منكر ونكير لنا فهو مختص بهذه الأمة أي أمة الدعوة المؤمنين والمنافقين والكافرين. From what is necessary to believe in is the questioning of the 2 angels, Munkar and Nakir. So he says, this is ala al-rajih, right? There's difference of opinion. It is specific to this ummah, meaning the ummah that the prophetic call relates to, right? Now, our previous people questioned, and the reason the ummah al-da'wah, why? Because what is the su'al of Munkar and Nakir that we know? Who is this man? Now, if the message of the Prophet ﷺ didn't reach someone, how could they be asked about that man? Right? So the ulama said that given what we know about Munkar and Nakir, Because the matters of the unseen, we affirm what has come. So why would someone during the time of, if of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, be questioned about Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam if they didn't know about him? Whether they be believers or hypocrites or disbelievers. وَمَحَلُّهُ بَعْدَ تَمَامِ الدَّفْنِ وَانْصِرَافِ النَّاسِ. And its time, its place, meaning its place in time, is after the complete burial and when the people leave. فَيُعِيدُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى الرُّوحَ إِلَى الْمَيِّتِ وَالْحَوَاسِ. And Allah returns the soul to the dead and their senses. فَيَرْتَفِقَانِ بِالْمُؤْمِنِ. So they're gentle with the believer. وَيَنْهَرَانِ الْكَافِرَ وَالْمُنَافِقِ. And they inspire awe in the disbeliever and the hypocrite. وَيُسْأَلُ كُلُّ إِنسَانٍ بِلُغَتِهِ. And each person will be questioned in their own tongue. وَيُجْمَعُ مَنْ تَفَرَّقَتْ أَجْزَاؤُهُ أَوْ أَكَلَتْهُ السِّبَاعُ. And those who were cut up into parts or eaten by animals, or who died by drowning, or who were blown up or whatever, they're gathered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the soul remains. The soul remains, even if the body, and the body at least as relates to the barzakh returns. How does it return? We don't know, because that's a different realm. We don't have, it's a one-way passage there. وأحوال المسؤولين مختلفة فمنهم من يسأله الملكان جميعا ومنهم من يسأله أحدهما وإذا مات جماعة في وقت واحد بأقاليم مختلفة سئلوا جميعا في ذلك الوقت ولا مانع من ذلك. And the states of those who will be questioned differ. Some will be asked by both angels and others by one. And if a whole group of people die at the same moment in different places, they'll all be questioned at the same moment, and there's nothing preventing it. Because how time relates to the barzakh differs from how it relates to this material universe. It has its own حقائق. وقال السيوطي رحمه الله تعالى يحتمل تعدد الملائكة المعدة لذلك. Imam Sawi said that it is possible that there be multiple angels prepared for this. كالحفظة ونحوهم. Just like the guarding angels and others. وسؤال مخصوص بمن كان مكلفا ولو جنا لا ملكا. The questioning is specific to those who are morally responsible, even if jinn, because the jinn are from the ummah al-da'wah, but not for the angels. So children are not questioned. Right? ويستثنى من المكلفين الأنبياء والصديقون والمرابطون والشهداء. And exempt from the questioning of the morally responsible will be the prophets and the siddiqeen, the veracious, which are the highest of the awliya al-salihin, of the highest of the righteous. وَالْمُرَابِطُونَ. And those who were those who were in a state of ribat, right? And the outward ribat is those who are protecting the frontiers of Islam from its enemies. And there are those who have the hukm of the murabitin, right? Those who are protecting the deen. وَالشُّهَدَاء. And the martyrs, right? وَمُلَازِمُ قِرَاءَةِ تَبَارَكَ الْمُلْكِ. And those who consistently recited Surah Tabarak, right? Surah al-Mulk, because of what's come regarding that, right? And the way of balance with the fada'il is that we affirm what is sound, or that whose weakness is not excessive. But one of the reductionist errors we also have to realize is that there are many surah, and Surah al-Mulk is a good example, where there's Yes, some of the ahadith that are marfu'a are weak, but there's so much that has been transmitted from the Sahaba about it. And we covered Surah Al-Mulk in one of our Quran circles. It's available, I believe, as an on-demand course. And this is one of the things. There's so many athar related to it. And the recommendation of reciting Surah Al-Mulk each night, is well established. كل ليلة أو سورة السجدة, or who consistently recites Surah Sajda. ومريض البطن, and the one who had stomach trouble. ومن مات ليلة الجمعة أو يومها, or someone who died on the eve of Friday or its day. إيمانا واحتسابا, in faith and sincerity to Allah. والمبطون, عفوا والمطعون, right? And the one who died by being speared, right? Or killed by a mortal wound. ومن قرأ الإخلاص في مرضه الذي مات فيه, and whoever recites Surah Al-Ikhlas in their final sickness. ونحو ذلك مما ورد في السنة استثناؤه, and the like of this, of what has been related in the Sunnah of being exemptions, right? So of course this part, these other things, because these are like fawaid al-aqaid, they're not qawaid al-aqaid. They're points of benefit, right? They're not principles of faith. ثم عذاب القبر, and then the punishment of the grave. أي مما يجب الإيمان به التصديق بعذاب القبر. From that which is necessary to believe in is to confirm as true the punishment of the grave. والمراد بالقبر البرزخ, and what's meant by the grave is not the physical grave, but the barzakh, the interworld. Right? It has a connection to the physical grave, but it's a different dimension. Shaykh Faisal Abdul Razak explained it really beautifully, and it stuck. He said, if someone told you that you could be eating through your stomach and living in water, would you believe it? There's humans out there who are eating through their stomach and living in water. That's exactly what's going on for fetuses. Fetuses, after 120 days, are human. Right? But where do they get their nourishment from? From their stomachs. And they're living surrounded by liquid. And they don't breathe air through their mouth and nose, etc. It's a different dimension. That's in the physical world, it's a different dimension. Just a few variables. It just in the belly rather than being out. What about a completely different world? Right? That's وإنما أضيف إلى القبر لأنه الغالب, and it's ascribed to the grave because the general case is that a person is buried and then they enter the interworld. وإلا فكل ميت أراد الله تعالى تعذيبه عذب قبر أو لم يقبر. Otherwise, any of the deceased whom Allah wills to be punished will be punished, whether buried or unburied. ولو أكلته الدواب أو حرق أو ذري في الهواء, even if eaten by animals or burnt or cast into the wind, pulverized, for example. ومحله الروح والبدن على المعتمد, and the punishment of the grave is both to the soul and the body according to the relied upon opinion. And you can see some details in the footnote, and you note, how often Hashiyat al-Amir and Tuhfat al-Murid are referred to. ويكون للكفار والمنافقين والعصاة من هذه الأمة أو غيرها. And the punishment of the grave happens to the disbelievers, to the hypocrites, and the sinners, meaning some sinners from this community and from other communities. ويدوم على الكفار والمنافقين, and it remains ongoing, the punishment of the grave, for the disbelievers and the corrupt, and for some of the sinners. وينقطع عمن خفت ذنوبه, and it's cut off from the one whose sins are lighter. ومن لم يسأل فيه لا يعذب فيه, and the one not questioned in it, in the grave, won't be punished in it. Because that's an honoring from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمِن جُمْلَةِ عَذَابِهِ, and from its punishment, ضَغْطَتُهُ, is the constriction of the grave. وَهُوَ الْتِقَاءُ حَافَّتَيْهِ, and it's for the two sides of the grave to come together. وَمِن جُمْلَتِهِ أَيضًا مَا فِي الْحَدِيثِ, and from the punishment as well is what's in the hadith, right? And the hadiths related by Imam Ahmad and others. And يُسَلَّطُ عَلَى الْكَافِرِ فِي قَبْرِهِ 99 تنينا تنهشه وتلدغه حتى تقوم الساعة. What's a tinnin? Yeah, it's like a great serpent, like a big snake, basically. You use fancier tool, right? Right? That attack him and sting him continually until حتى تقوم الساعة, until the final hour. ولو أن تنينا منها نفخ على الأرض ما أنبتت خضراء. And if one of these snakes cast its poison once on this worldly earth, and no vegetation would grow again upon it. It's a sound hadith. ومنها تشكل عمله بصورة قرد أو خنزير يضاجعه في قبره. And from the punishment of the grave is that one's sinful acts take the form of an ape or a pig, and they keep one's constant company in the grave. وفتح طاقة فيه من جهنم, and there'll be a channel being opened from the grave to one's seat in hell. ويسمع صياحه, and one hears the wailing of hell. من العذاب ما عدا الثقلين. عفوا, ويسمع صياحه من العذاب ما عدا الثقلين. And the wailing of the punishment of those in the grave is heard by those other than the humans and the jinn. They're able to hear it. Doesn't mean they necessarily hear it. This is of course furu' of Iman, some of these. وَنَعِيمُهُ, and its bliss, meaning the na'im al-qabr, the blessing of the grave, the rewards. أي وصول النعيم للمؤمنين في القبور, meaning the attainment of bliss for the believers in their graves. ولا يختص بهذه الأمة, it is not specific to this ummah. ولا بالمكلفين, and nor with the morally responsible. ومن جملة نعيمه توسيعه, and from its bliss is its being made expansive. وفتح طاقة فيه من الجنة, and an opening being granted from it to paradise. وجعله روضة من رياضها, and Allah is making the grave of the believer a garden of the gardens of paradise. وتصوير عمله بصورة حسنة تؤانسه, and for one's actions to take a beautiful form that becomes an intimate companion for one in one's grave. The Prophet ﷺ said, القبر روضة من رياض الجنة أو حفرة من حفر النيران. The grave is either a garden of the gardens of paradise or a pit of the pits of hell. Of course, one of the most important aspects of the protection of the grave is salamatu al-i'tiqad wal-mawt alayh, is to have sound belief and to die upon it. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal mentioned, and it's quoted by Abu Ya'la, a great Hanbali Imam, in his Tabaqat of the Hanabila. He said that قبور فساق المؤمنين روضة وقبور عباد أهل البدعة حفرة. It's heavy words. That the graves of even the corrupt of Ahl Sunnah are a garden of paradise, and the graves of the people of innovation the graves of the devotees, the ubad, of the people of innovation, are a pit of hell. Right? وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنْ افْتَرَى عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبًا. Who is a greater wrongdoer than who casts lies about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? So one needs to be careful, and you see it. But of course, you have to be careful not to judge anybody, and you're not there to judge, but you need to be careful, and you never judge anyone, but make intelligent choices of company and so on, because it harms, right? مثل صاحب السوء, the example of a bad companion, it's like the difference between the attar, the perfume seller. If you don't get any, or they don't dab you with it, at least you're left with the good smell. And the example of the bad companion is like nafikhul kir, is like the metal, the ironsmith, right? Who blows on their bellow, right, to heat the furnace. If you don't get burned from it, you may be affected by some of its sparks. And if that doesn't happen, then at least you'll be left smelling bad. Right? Meaning that mulazamat husn al-suhbah is one of the keys to protection in all of this. Right? And then he talks about كبعث الحشر, right? That our necessity to believe in النشر والحشر, right? The coming forth from the graves and then being gathered. So we'll continue from there, بإذن الله تعالى, right? And it'd be good, at the very least, if like we can share the link to Imam al-Haddad's book. The section on the hereafter is actually quite short. It's a brief work, right? Right? And the life of the grave is brief in it, and then the hereafter, and that's. But you could also, for a quick review, look through Imam Dardir's sharh on the Kharida, because he has a nice breakdown. He mentions the key verses and so on as well. And we can share the link to that. We should just add it as a resource, just the Sharh al-Kharida, the Sheikh Shannar edition, and also Sabilul Iddikar, right, for those able to follow along. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.